So I will go ahead and start kicking us off. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for being here. My name is Emily Carlson. I'm your host for the evening. And welcome to the Bee Steward Program lectures. We're really happy to have you. These are a free component of our Bee Steward program, which is an online, self-paced and interactive program designed to help you understand your property and how to enhance the plants on your property to improve bee habitat. So the program itself, you can learn more about at this little link at the bottom. But we go through bee biology, we lead you through a habitat assessment, and then how to build habitat and restore your site to improve for bees. One of the things that's really unique about this program is during your participation, you perform a plant inventory. So you collect information on what plants are already there on your property, and then you'll get a list from the instructors that let you know which species you could plant, which new plant species you could install that would increase your bee biodiversity. And so really making sure you're getting the most bang for your buck. If you want to see more bees on your property, it's a great way to fill that gap. And then I also just want to highlight that we are so lucky to have Andy Neill with us today. Andy is joining us from the Greenbelt Land Trust. He joined as a habitat biologist in 2022, bringing more than 2 decades of experience working in the prairies and forests of Western Oregon. Before coming to Greenbelt, he spent 7 years with the Institute for Applied Ecology, where he expanded his knowledge of restoration and conservation work. At Greenbelt, Andy is responsible for multiple properties and large-scale grant-funded restoration projects across upland and wetland prairies, as well as oak woodlands and savannas. This work ranges from writing grants and developing budgets to designing native seed mixes, coordinating contractors, and operating machinery. And he also helps identify new properties for acquisition. So Andy has a very strong background in habitat, and we're really excited to be learning from him today.
Thank you for that introduction. Appreciate it. Pretty much nailed it. I could probably just stop there and we're done for the day, but I'll actually go through my lecture for the day. Pretty excited to be here. I've done talks like this multiple times, given quite a few tours of our properties and what we're doing out there, but this is my first webinar, so my camera's up there. I know that, but I might be looking somewhere else. So just bear with me. As Emily said, I'm a habitat biologist with Greenbelt Land Trust. I've been here since 2022 and have an extensive background in biology, some geology and some chemistry and whatnot, and some forestry. So I'd like to say that I use all of those in my job. And so I'm pretty excited to share with you what I do. I work for Greenbelt Land Trust, and this is our service area, and it's primarily the Willamette Valley, but we more just recently extended our service area from crest to crest across the Willamette Valley to the Cascade and Coast Range, and then also Yamhill County and portions of Clackamas and Lane County. And this is new to us. This is including a lot more forested properties. Doesn't mean that we're going to be seeking out properties. It just means that we're really just interested in conserving and protecting properties and habitats for fish and wildlife throughout this region. The Greenbelt Land Trust was formed in 1989, and we currently have over 6,000 acres and 38 more or less properties. Some are joined, so that number kind of fluctuates a little bit. And our biggest property is about 1,600 acres in the South Valley in Lane County. And then we have smaller easements on smaller family-owned properties as well. But we do own properties in fee outright, and then we have easements on those properties that are owned by other entities. And an easement is a legal document that determines what we can and cannot do on the property, and we usually call those conservation easements, meaning the property is protected in perpetuity, which means forever. I am part of the stewardship program, We do a lot of the on-the-ground restoration, a lot of the management of our properties, which means restoration, but also means infrastructure. We have a lot of roads that we need to maintain, culverts, even some buildings that we need to provide upkeep for. We also have a outreach program, and they're involved with our volunteers, membership management, and then also bringing in funds for our organization. Another program is the conservation program, and their primary purpose is to work through acquisition, seek out new properties, and I do work closely with them when we're starting to look at new properties, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. And this is just to give you a little context of what my typical year looks like. And just like all the plants and animals out there, we move through the seasons in different patterns and different strategies for each one. And so in the spring, we're really doing our property and habitat assessments. I'm going out to see what worked, what didn't work, what's growing, what things we might have in the future, plan for some weed treatments, implement some weed treatments. I start to think about plant materials for my restoration projects. And I'm also starting to work with equipment and other contractors, make sure we have things lined up. In the summer, I'm starting to do mowing. We're also doing contractor coordination and starting to do some earthwork on our properties, and I'll get into that in a bit as well. And then I'm starting to plan for fall and winter. In the fall, which is the busiest time of year for me, I'm doing a lot of woody and weed treatments, seeding and planning for prescribed burns, implementing those prescribed burns, and then doing a lot of meetings, outreach reportings, and grant writings, and sometimes things like this. And it's my busiest season, and it's very difficult to fit all those in. So I'm very happy that this is actually a winter presentation because it's a lot easier for me to commit to. In the winter, we're actually doing a tree and shrub planting, doing our grant writing and reporting, and then doing a lot of our maintenance of our equipment that broke down during the summer or spring and just getting things ready, oil changes, that kind of stuff. And then I'm starting to plan for my spring and summer. So we used to say that we had down times, but in reality, we're still pretty busy quite a bit throughout the whole year. And so the beginning of restoration planning really starts when we start just looking at a property. And I'm going to use this property. It's Lucky Mute Confluence. It's one of our most recent acquisitions. It's on the Willamette. It's got the Lucky Mute River flowing there at the north edge. And on the north and south end is the Lucky Mute State Natural Area. So as we start looking at a property before acquisition, I'll go out to a property, walk it, see what's out there, see what the potential is, what kind of habitats are already there, what kind of habitats could be there if we do some work, what kind of houses, what kind of infrastructure is there, what really would the lift be to restore a property like this. And I'm also evaluating like what's the significance of this property? How does it fit into our portfolio? How does it fit into the protected properties throughout the valley that isn't just ours, but this property is smack dab in between Oregon State Parks properties. So when this property came up for sale, it was extremely important to us and also to State Parks to acquire. State Parks doesn't have the ability to move fast, and so we actually move faster than we ever have and acquire this property because of its conservation values, because of its location and the value to protected properties throughout the valley. So that is the Willamette there. And then if we were to expand out from here, you'd actually see the Santiam River coming in from the east. So not only is it ecologically important, this property for floodplain protected properties, but also culturally, any confluence is a culturally important place. So it's also of value for that reason. And so when we're starting to think about this property for acquisition in my mind and even on paper, we're starting to come up with a restoration plan, what it is we would want to do with the property. So that's when planning starts for us. Here's another view of the property. So there it is outlined in red, and you can see the state natural area, the north and the south portions. And the photo on the right is from 2006. And so the importance of this property as a floodplain protected property is very important. So it regularly is inundated either from the Lucky Mute backing up or even from the Willamette flowing onto the property. And so our intention for this property is actually to plant over 100,000 trees on this property. So we've already begun work. We've already have grant funding for the property and been working on it. And if anybody has questions, I guess feel free to pipe up. I don't have the capacity to see the hand raises, but maybe Emily could help me. So I'm going to move on to active restoration and restoration we've been doing in the last few years. And this will give you context for what I'm talking about. So I'll be talking about, if you can see my pointer, more or less this prairie right here, these wet prairie properties that are in brown right here. I'm also going to talk about Mulkey Ridge later on in the talk, and I'll also lean on Oak Creek Preserve a little bit. These are all properties that are owned by Greenbelt Land Trust, and then easements of these properties are owned by either BPA or OEB. Oak Creek Preserve is a property that we own outright. There's no conservation easement on the property, and that's for a pretty good reason. We want to put trails on the property, and usually when you have an easement, it makes it very difficult to put trails on the property. So I'm going to zoom out again, and then I'll zoom back in, but these are the fields I'm going to be talking about in the main part of the restoration that I have for this discussion. This is an interesting painting from 1912 and a photograph taken much more contemporary and more recently. Oh, it's not what I want. As you can see, Bald Hill, which is in the center of the property this year, is not necessarily bald anymore. And then Mulkey Ridge is this ridge here. And so the fields that I'll be talking about are down in this little valley here, right around in here. And so historically, the cultural burning that happened in the valley maintained pretty open habitats dominated by grasses and forbs. And to a lesser extent, trees and shrubs were limited to maybe the north-facing slopes or up on Marius Peak, you can see in the distance there. And so when we're doing our restoration planning, we're thinking about the historical, what the property looked historically, and we are definitely thinking about the cultural implications of this as well when we do our restoration planning. So a lot of these hill slopes are dominated by prairie soils, not necessarily forest soils. If you walk into the forest, you can see that these are mature Douglas fir trees growing up along these ridges, but they are first generation Douglas fir, and there are likely not many stumps in some of these areas that haven't been harvested. We also look at more recent activity on the property. So this is a 1936 aerial imagery, and you can see that farming was going on the west portion of the property, and then grazing on the rest. So this is all being farmed here. And then the grazing was happening down over here. So we're looking at these images to get an idea of what was here before, what infrastructure might have been put in. The yellow is the current road, but the original road actually went right through the middle of our restoration. And then it was decommissioned at some point and then put up here. So we have a layer of gravel that runs along in the middle of the property. Then we also look at the soils. Soils are very important to determine what plants will likely grow there, what is most appropriate. These soils probably developed in wetter conditions. So that means in the green, that means that we should probably be restoring that to wet prairie. In the pink and the purple, those are a bit more upland, so those should most likely be restored to upland prairie. And that'll determine what I call my seed mixes. So I won't be putting as many wet prairie species in the upland, and I won't be putting as many upland species in the wet prairie. The next step is also to look at the hydrology and the topography of the land. Where's the water going? What structures have been put in there to divert water off the property or siphon it off? And that was done to increase the farming activity or grazing capacity of these pastures or fields. And so you can see that there are a couple of culverts that have been put in. This is now a cross trail that bisects the property that is accessed from Bald Hill Natural Area onto our property. And so what are some of the structures that we found on this property were drainage tiles in this property here. And that was primarily, their drainage tiles are perforated pipes of some fashion that are put underground, which then drain the property and pull siphon water off and direct it somewhere else. So knowing that, we had to disrupt those drainage tiles to keep water onto the property, or drainage ditches, fill those to divert water back onto the property. And we're interested in that to restore the hydrology of what's going on in these prairies. We're also looking at potential areas to excavate vernal pools. Vernal pools are a type of habitat that really aren't that common anymore, along with the wet prairie and upland prairie habitat. So creating these vernal pools that have ponds that dry out throughout the summer create a unique habitat that is pretty rare in the Willamette Valley. So if we have an opportunity to create a vernal pool for wintertime waterfowl, amphibians, insects, and then a specific diversity of plants has been key for a few of our properties, including this property, Bald Hill Farm. Even more recently, we were doing those pastures were being grazed, and there's been a long history of grazing at Bald Hill Farm, and it still continues. Grazing is most likely is not conducive to conservation values, as you might think, just as having a trail across a property is not conducive to conservation values when you're thinking about wildlife and habitats. But for this particular property, we had to argue in favor of keeping grazing on the property, and I'll get into that later. But a pasture like this is quite a bit different when you're thinking about restoration versus what we were dealing with at Oak Creek Preserve, which was a ryegrass field. So this ryegrass field is a monoculture of grass for the most part, and it's been managed that way for a while. So the weed component is pretty low versus a pasture where it's being managed for a variety of forage species, and weeds aren't necessarily as big of an issue as it is within a crop. So our starting point here is a lot different than our starting point at Oak Creek Preserve, which is just across the street from these fields. Once we have a pretty good idea of what we want to do on a property, and we have what type of restoration we want to do, and get an idea of how much it's going to cost, we start to bring in partners. We bring in all the people that we've been working with in the past, maybe some new partners. OEB is an important funding source for us. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is an important partner for us. They're a great source for equipment through their partners program, but they're also a source for threatened and endangered species. Threatened and endangered species are managed, and we can't buy those on the open market. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are the people that work with other growers to grow them, and then they disperse the threatened and endangered seed for threatened and endangered species. So they're important partners for us. So we usually have them come out on a lot of these exploratory walks with us to talk about what our options are and what kind of funding we should go after. So back to the fields that I circled at the beginning, this is kind of our starting point. So August 2020, before restoration started, one of the things we would do is to sort of break things up into manageable chunks, and that's kind of what I did here. Most of it is wet prairie. They're divided by ditches. This is upland prairie here, so it will receive different treatments. It's a little bit of a different starting point. And then we also are putting in spots where we might put in some vernal pools. So that's what the red is, and those will become more apparent in the next few slides. So these next two slides are a basic, very, very basic 4-year restoration plan. And this is partially based on funding cycles. Grant grants are usually 3 to 5 years, and so we usually try to fit in our restoration into those 3 to 5 years, depending on how long we have to do it. But sometimes we will start early, and sometimes we will have to ask for extensions because things don't go as planned. But this basic plan is generally what we tend to follow. So year one for a prairie restoration, whether we're going from an agricultural field or a pasture, we'll begin a chemical fallow. It means we're trying to get to bare dirt. We're trying to deplete the weed seed bank. And so we'll apply herbicide to the property 2 to 3 times a year to try to get to the bare ground and to deplete the weed seed bank. We also start working on cultural compliance. If we're working with any U.S. government dollars or other in-kind resources like Fish and Wildlife Service bringing their earth moving equipment out, we need to do cultural compliance, which means hiring people to come out, inspect the property, see, make sure we're not disturbing any important cultural sites and other even more recent culturally important sites is something to consider as well. So before we can get any U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service equipment out, we have to have that done. We also start to plan our earthwork, which means a little bit of work with maps, GIS, determining where these vernal pools might go, where our ditches are need to be filled, and then also where our drainage tiles need to be excavated. Year two, we're going to continue the chemical fallow, keep doing the herbicide work to try to deplete the seed bank. And then we're going to implement our earthwork. And then we're going to start doing our spot treatments, getting those weeds that are coming up that we didn't know were there along the edges, and try to prepare our site for receiving seed. Then we start to plan our plant materials. If we're doing a big tree and shrub planting like we're doing at Lucky Mint Confluence this coming in the next couple of months, we actually need to order those 100,000 trees in advance. We can't just go a week in advance and have those trees ready. That's too big of an ask. So actually, 2 years before we even received the grant funds, we ordered the plants. We were pretty darn confident that we would get the grant funding. We were pretty darn confident that we were going to acquire the property, and we made the leap to order the trees and shrubs for that property way in advance because that's how far we needed to do it to be able to get the job done. And so, but for prairie restoration, if we're just doing seed, we usually start planning for those the year before and then are able to order them in the spring before we do our seeding. So year three, we're still continuing with the chemical fallow. We may do some more disking and harrowing to prepare the seed bed, continue our spot treatments, and then fine tune the earthwork. And then for the spring, we would order our seed, get that all ready for our fall seeding. And that's probably the most stressful part for me, is to get all the seed ready and then into the ground in that fall. Then year four, we shift to more of a management. So we're doing spot treatments. We're not doing our broadcast herbicide treatments. And then we would also start to plan our mowing and possibly prescribe burning. Usually when we complete a restoration, maybe 3 to 5 years after we're completed with the restoration, we'll start to think about implementing a prescribed burn. We also will do planting bulbs, plugs, bare root plants in the fourth year, and those are usually species that either don't establish well from seed or are hard to get, or we would just like to get flowering a little bit sooner. Camas bulbs usually take 5 to 8 years from seed to start blooming, but if we plant a bulb, we can usually get flowering in a couple of years. So, and other things like strawberries. I've never seen strawberry seed for strawberries sold, and I'd love it if you came up with a way to produce a lot of strawberry seed, but those are species that we can't get in the ground by seed, so we have to buy those as bare root plants. And then year four, we also start applying for additional funding. Some of these properties are large enough that we need to do multiple phases of restoration. And then also maybe we'd be doing tree work in the next phase, or breaking it up and doing multiple prairie restorations on the same property. However, as part of the grant writing process, a very detailed budget needs to go into the grant, and that's where the restoration plan really has the meat. We have to basically be able to pay for every action, every supplies, and so we have to plan that out for all 3 years. And so when I am starting to do my restoration planning, I will be looking at the budget, and that's usually what my go-to spot is going to be. And that budget will tell us how much we can spend where and in what year. And so that's really our restoration plan. Part of the restoration plot process and also the land conservation process requires us to write a land management plan, and that's really a broad plan for the property with very few details. And so that will be our starting point as part of the acquisition and the easement process. The plant materials are the most expensive part of the project. Currently, we're budgeting about $1,300 per acre for seed. And so, but when we were doing the restoration on the Bald Hill Farm, we budgeted for about $80,000 for seed alone. So about $1,000 an acre. But so with the way things are going, costs have gone up. We're going to be budgeting for about $1,300 per acre for seed alone. The trees and shrubs, those vary in price, but usually they're 80, 85, 80 cents a stem. So 100,000 trees, you can do the math on the cost of those trees. Back to Bald Hill Farm. This is in the fallow process. So we've started spraying the fields. They're brown. They remain brown for a while. They're actually gray because the soil is pretty dark. So we're getting down to bare soil, which is what we're after. But we still have trees and shrubs. We still have ditches out there. We still have some ash that we would like to take out just to make it more of an open prairie and to reduce the potential for the ash to seed into the prairie, which will take additional management in the future. So we did a lot of earthwork, but we also did a lot of tree work. So if I go back and forth, you can see the row of ash and trees and shrubs here, and also these ash trees along here that we actually took out to create a more open prairie. We also excavated the vernal pools to hold water, and they're still holding water, which is great. We did get seed on this upland portion, so that's why it's kind of green, but the rest of the prairie was seeded with a cover crop of a native grass, and then we sprayed that, and that's why it's brown. Here's part of the tree removal process. There is no market for ash. We couldn't pay somebody to, or we couldn't receive money from somebody to come and harvest our ash and haul it off the property. So we basically have to pay for everything. Hauling off ash off the property is pretty darn expensive. Chipping it into a truck and hauling it away is even more expensive. And so we came up with a pretty innovative process. We hired a company that basically plucked all the majority of the ash trees, mostly the small ones, and laid them out into rows. You can see here. And then eventually we came back in and masticated them. We left the oaks and most of the large ash, and they're still there. But after they lined up all the ash trees and shrubs, they came back with some pretty large equipment, masticated in place, chipped it in place, and then with another piece of equipment called a rotavator, incorporated those chips into the soil as best they could. Obviously, this is going to affect the soil quality and the characteristics. We weren't quite sure what this would do, and we're still waiting to see what the long-term effects are. But even with all this wood chip in the soil, we're still having pretty good seeding results in these spots in this wet prairie. As we might expect, all the wood in the soil can deplete the available nitrogen, but we're seeing it, not quite seeing a lot of it here, but we're still waiting to see what will happen since we're only 1 and 2 years out on the seeding here. I'm sure you've just been dying to hear about how we create the vernal pools. We work with Fish and Wildlife Service to do this. They brought in their scraper. They do this at no cost to us. This is a huge benefit to us. We are part of a program called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, and run by the Fish and Wildlife Service out of Findlay, which is local. And they do this conservation work on private landowners' properties, which is us and other landowners as well. But the scraper comes in, pulls off the topsoil, strip by strip, and then stashes the topsoil over here. It excavates down all the as much as they can and get down to the clay. Then they dig up clay and create a berm with the clay. Once they've got everything to where they want it to be, then they bring the topsoil back on top of the berm and spread out the rest of the topsoil over the clay a little bit. And then we have a predetermined depth of the pool and a predetermined height of the berm, which is determined by our permitting to have this done. Another thing that we had the Fish and Wildlife Service do was to chase the drainage tiles, and that's exactly what this disturbance is here. So they would use an excavator, dig down until they hit the drainage tile, and then just keep chasing it with the excavator until they can't find it anymore. So they chase the drainage tile all the way up near to the end of the property, which is where we have a road and a farmhouse, and we had to stop digging. Otherwise, we would be excavating our road. So we still have a drainage tile under there, which does bring up water year round, which is kind of interesting. So now we have a little bit of a spring, but it doesn't run all the way down across the property. It goes underground or evaporates in the summertime. And then here's our restoration field in December 2022. So it's right after we had sowed a cover crop onto the property. The disturbance of the work that we've been doing was compounded by the heavy rains that we had in 2022. We had several atmospheric rivers that came through and dumped a lot of water on the property. So I did try to slow water down. You can see down here straw bale, and there were a few more on the property. So that was probably one of the drawbacks of the earthwork that we did. And then in 2023, we did some fine tuning of our vernal pool that we created. And as you can see, that's October 28th. And so that vernal pool filled in much sooner than we had anticipated due to the atmospheric rivers. This created a lot of problems for us. Not only was it erosion, but we had planned to put our native seed into this prairie. And the start of the rains makes it so our equipment won't run in the damp soil. So it pretty much shut us down, and we didn't have a chance to put a cover crop onto these fields. So it wasn't the end of the world, but it did slow us down. And the additional year meant that we needed an additional year of keeping the chemical fallow on the property. So it was an additional cost to us, and we had to ask for an extension. As I mentioned, the erosion was a big problem for us that we had to mitigate for. We tried a few different things. One was a straw bale, another one was a wattle, which is the straw stuffed tubes that you've probably seen around construction sites. Tried those, but the most effective method was a beaver dam analog. So me and our volunteer coordinator and a bunch of volunteers were able to install these pretty easily and effectively by just shoving willow stakes into the ground and then weaving willows in between the stakes to effectively slow the water down. As you can see, the straw bale just basically stopped the water and then diverted it to either side and just made the problem worse. Whereas the beaver dam analogs just slowed things down and caught some of the sediment. So we are planning to put more of these out at Bald Hill Farm and at our Oak Creek Preserve property in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in coming out and helping with that, you can check on our website and register for that. And it's actually a pretty fun endeavor to get out there and do that and see immediate impacts. These willows will survive. However, because we're working in wet prairie and we want to maintain the openness, Once they've kind of outlived their usefulness in slowing water down, we will probably mow over them with our skid steer, masticate them, and probably even treat the stems to so they don't regrow. As I mentioned, seed is the most expensive part, and it takes a lot of effort. I've got a little video here, and I'll just play it as I talk. But it takes a lot of planning to get all the seed. So that seed that you're looking at was seeded at Bald Hill Farm, and so that's realistically about $50,000 worth of seed that I'm mixing right there. But it is a lot of planning, determining on what kind of property, what kind of habitat we're seeding for. So this is all wet prairie mix, and so it has a lot of sedges, rushes, wet prairie forbs, it has a mix of annuals, perennials, and also wet prairie grasses. So putting that all together takes a lot of planning. Each one is going to be different. I design each one specifically for a property and then work with our local growers to purchase the seed from them. And the exact mix is going to be different from year to year, just because the different species are available in different quantities from the growers, or maybe we already have something out there and I don't need to put it in the mix. So it takes a lot of thought, and the process is very satisfying once it's completed. So this is April 2024. The upland has been seeded for a few years. This area has been was seeded the previous fall, and so it's starting to show green, whereas this down here is undergoing another year of fallow. So most of what you see the green out there are the pasture weeds that keep coming up, and you receive another season of treatments as well as our little secret meadow down here. And then this is May of 2025, this past year, and you can see the green up happening for a second year of growth up here and multiple years of growth up here, and then the first year of growth down here. And then this is what happened the first spring after the seeding. So this is in the first field, so that we were able to seed before the rain shut us down. And we get a real explosion of the annuals coming up first, and the perennials usually take a few years to come out. This also happens to be where I was loading the seed drill, the equipment that we use to put seed on the ground. So I did happen to spill a little extra seed, so it looks quite vibrant. This is from the same location looking in the other direction, so not quite as colorful, but still quite amazing. As you might expect, each seed of each species is a different size. And so when I'm calculating my seed mix, I'm using a calculator. I'm using the number of seeds per pound, and I'm also have an estimate of how many seeds per square foot I hope to get on the ground. And as you can see, there's a magnitude of difference between the biggest seed, the big leaf lupin, and the smallest seed of the mimulus, which is actually the yellow flower that you see flowering in the picture, the monkey flower. And so if you can imagine trying to go out and spread all these seed evenly throughout the prairie, which I call kind of a shotgun approach. I'm trying to disperse seed evenly throughout the prairie, and eventually it will find its niche and grow from there. It's very difficult. So when we use our equipment, which we're driving with a tractor, seed will sort itself out pretty quickly. So to mitigate that, so we try to get seed to disperse throughout the prairie, we will periodically add seed in small batches to the bins. And that actually extends the time it takes to drive the seed drill out, because we're constantly having to check and add more seed. So Bald Hill Farm, we finished seeding there in May of 2024, and we had probably closer to 800 pounds of seed that went out onto the prairie. We did a lot of tall camas out there, so in the next 5 to 10 years, we should see a lot of camas coming up in those fields. But we also had 70 other species as well, so a very diverse mix. And these species also included Nelson's checker mallow, Bradshaw's limatium, Willamette daisy, All species either were recently delisted as endangered or threatened species or are currently endangered. So this is in contrast of another field that we did restoration. This is an upland prairie, so a different mix of species. But this is year 5, so this is this summer. And I looked at this picture for quite a while, and I can still only count 3 species. So one, we have the dwarf checker mallow, which is the pink. In the background, you can see the tall camas, which is now flowering. And you can see some tall camas vegetative growing up here as well. And then the other species is the Romer's fescue. So over the course of 5 years, we've lost quite a bit of diversity. Obviously, we're not seeing some of the earlier flowering species, but even then, the diversity was still pretty low. So in a situation like this, we try to think about, well, where did we lose diversity? And but also, how do we maintain diversity? So maybe we seeded some species too heavily, or they succeeded too well and just outcompeted the others, or we didn't add enough of the other species. In this case, we would like to add diversity, and it also happens to be a location where we are introducing Taylor's checker spot butterfly, which is a rare endangered butterfly in the valley. And we would like to improve the habitat for that butterfly. And to add diversity and improve the habitat, probably the best mechanism to get to bare soil is going to be completion of a prescribed burn. So over this last year and a half, we worked with various entities and ultimately landed with Oregon Department of Forestry to complete a prescribed burn on this probably about 25 to 30 acre area so we could add more diversity, specifically add a species, which is the host plant, golden paintbrush, for the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. And had everything done. Had all of everything was ready to go, and ODF was ready to come in the morning. And at 6 a.m., they had a slash fire on a private property that they had to go put out. So needless to say, we did not come across another opportunity this last year to do a prescribed burn. So we're going to hopefully do it this next year. Pretty excited about that. That would be the first prescribed burn we've had at Bald Hill Farm, and let alone any of our other properties in the last 5 to 10 years. This is Ruby. This is our tractor. Sorry, I was just looking at the time. And this is our seed drill, and this is how we operate to put seed on the ground on our wet prairies and our upland prairies and wherever we can. However, on the right, you can see a forest where we had a timber harvest and an oak release. How do we operate our machinery in that? And so I'm going to shift gears to the Mulkey Ridge property, which is at the west end of the Bald Hill Farm property over here. So it's 170 acres. And we had a timber harvest, which was also to release oak and to create oak savanna, prairie, and oak woodland, improve the oak woodland. So most of what I'm going to be talking about is over there at this point, which is now up here on this ridge, back up here. Here's the before and the after of all the tree work we did on the property. We worked with Trout Mountain Forestry to write the forest management plan and also implement the timber harvest. As you can see, we did the timber harvest during the pandemic, which was unique in itself, but it was a full-blown timber harvest to release the oak. The Douglas fir was merchantable, so we did take off quite a bit of Douglas fir and sold it for a profit, but the profit all went back straight into the property. It gave us a little bit more flexibility to get to this state that we want, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if we want to drive our tractor in this to either mow or to put seed on the ground, we're going to have to deal with the biomass that was left from the timber harvest. A lot of it was burned in piles, but we were left with quite a bit of wood on the ground. And as you can see, during the process of the pile burning, this was a previously cleared area. And if you were all here, I'd ask you all to raise your hand if you see a stump. We don't. We needed to clear the area so we could actually use our equipment safely and to reduce biomass on the ground so we could get to the soil surface for our seeding that we were going to do on this property. So we used some of the same equipment that we did down to remove the ash. And we tried first with more of a traditional approach, which is the skid steer with an auger attachment. And that moved from stump to stump and left with a pile of wood chips. But if we use this equipment, which was much more expensive, so this equipment on this roof, it's the Raptor on the bottom, costs about $850 an hour to have them operate. But even then, it was more efficient and faster for them to blow through all the stumps in a matter of minutes versus 10 minutes per stump with the skid steer. So even though it was more expensive per hour, the efficiency of it was much more effective for us and cost effective. And it got us to a state where we could apply our seed with our equipment and we can mow without worrying too much about hitting a stump or other logs that are left on the property. So the challenges for this project at Mulkey Ridge were really about the biomass and how do we deal with the biomass? How do we get to the seed? How do we get the seed to the soil surface? The other challenges were the topography and also seasonal constraints. As you can imagine, fire risk is higher, so we have to stop our forest operations, and then also bird nesting season is also something we always need to respect. And the way I like to talk about a biomass is that the more you pay, the smaller the chips you get. And that's still true for some of the other projects we have in the pipeline for Greenbelt. And then we also were wondering what would come up with all this wood chip that was on the ground. Well, we were pretty surprised, at least I was, to see some of this, and we're still waiting to see how it pans out. But as you can see here, there's two lupins coming up in the wood chips. The top one is just is a miniature lupin, which is pretty common. And I do like to include it in my seed mix because it flowers early and is pretty reliable. The lupin on the bottom is Kincaid's lupin, and it's a threatened species, and it is a host plant for Fenner's blue butterfly. And these seeds were broadcast by hand, and there are a few other species that are taprooted, much like Kincaid's lupin. Wyethia or California compass plant, mule's ear are all the same species, but they're taprooted. And so the large seed falls through the cracks and then immediately hits the soil surface and then sends a taproot down. Lupins are, as most of you know, nitrogen fixers, so they're able to persist in these probably most likely nitrogen poor areas where all the wood chips are because of the bacteria utilizing the nitrogen to break down the wood. The ability of the lupins to fix their own nitrogen allows them to persist probably a little bit better in these areas. So I'm pretty excited to see that broadcast seed of Kincaid's lupin is going to be growing up in the Mulkey area. The map on the right is showing the different seed mixes I use. So the orange is the woodland mix, and then the pink is where I put a higher diversity mix, including a lot more forbs and Kincaid's lupin. This next few slides are gearing towards our threatened and endangered species. We often seek out funding that help to protect or improve the recovery of endangered species, but realistically and in reality, we are searching out these grants under their name, but we are just trying to create healthy habitats, sustainable habitats for these species. And so if we can do that and have them persist in perpetuity, that's what we're aiming for. So these are some of the species we're working with currently. A few of them are delisted. Bradshaw's lamatium was delisted. primarily because of a property that we were able to acquire, which put a check in a box for conserved property and a population in a specific area. These are some of the butterflies that we work closely with. I'd like to talk about Taylor sugar spot quickly because of the host plant, which is a non-native English plantain, which means they didn't co-evolve, but they have found each other. Original host plant was probably golden paintbrush, and it was extirpated in the valley, has been reintroduced into the valley, and is now a delisted species. These are photos of our reintroduction efforts with Fish and Wildlife Service using releasing captively reared larvae of Taylor's chickasaw butterfly that were captively reared in a women's correctional facility in Oregon. We also have managed for Oregon vesper sparrow, which, as I said before, we still allow grazing. The grazing creates a ground nesting habitat for this bird. And if we stopped grazing on the property, it's likely that this rare bird, wouldn't come back to Bald Hill Farm. Looking to the future, emerald ash borer is something we're thinking about, and Mediterranean oak borer. We're thinking about warmer, drier climates, potential for increased fire risk, and we're also going to be restoring large properties, including this one. It's just San Kingston Hills and Kingston Prairie, which is up by state. If you haven't been to Kingston Prairie yet, it is probably the highest quality wet prairie habitat out there. And in the spring, it's just beautiful. And it is open to public. We don't have trails. We don't advertise it except to you. And this is where I thank all of our partners listed here and many, many more, and can open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. We have some really great questions in the chat, just like launching off. First of all, like, what were some of the considerations you had when deciding how deep to dig the vernal pools?
That is pretty much determined by our permit. So we have an ending depth, I think 18 inches is as deep as we can go. And then the berm height was also determined by that. I think we could go deeper, but that's a different kind of permit.
Gotcha. And then we also had a question about how your grant administration, how the current administration has impacted grant funding. If you feel comfortable talking about that, if you don't, it's okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do work closely with a lot of Fish and Wildlife Service staff. And so our first concern was really with them and their ability to come out and help us with our projects. We did have one grant that was in the process of not necessarily getting funded, but it did get shut down. But all of our other funding did keep going, even some BLM funding. We consider ourselves very lucky. We have a very diverse set of funding sources, but a lot of our grant funding is actually state funding.
Wow. I'm really glad to hear that you guys have such a resilient financial base for the important work that your organization is doing. We also had a question in the chat from Rachel. Would burning be better for ash due to the risk from the emerald ash borer, or would chipping have the same effect to stop the spread to more mature trees that are left behind?
The main source of spreading for emerald ash borer is wood, firewood. So it does move by itself, but it's going to go from ash tree to ash tree, not forest to forest. And so it is going to be slow. There's really nothing we can do to stop the spread. And you can protect individual trees, but the anticipation is 99.9% of ash trees are going to die in the next 30, 40 years. So that time frame is still flexible, but they also predict by 2045, emerald ash borer is going to be throughout the state. So there's really, judging by what's going on the East Coast, there's no slowing the spread per se, other than not moving firewood. And we usually don't move firewood. That's not what we do. So we're not probably going to be working to killing the emerald ash borer. We're just going to be trying to maintain that habitat that's there that's going to die. Our anticipation is that the ash forest is going to die, and then what's going to come up is what's there, and most likely it's Himalayan blackberry or canary grass.
For those of us who maybe aren't as familiar, it's an invasive insect that has wiped out the ash populations on the East Coast, and it's been recently found in Oregon. And by recently, I mean the last 2 years, I want to say.
Yeah.
And so we know that it's here and we know that it is likely spreading. So, okay, we had a question from Eliana in the chat that says, who are some of the local seed suppliers you like to work with?
I've got a few that I go through. Pacific Northwest Natives is one. River Refuge, they do a lot of wet prairie stuff, so a lot of sedges and rushes. And then my main supplier is Heritage Seedlings. Linda Boyer, I think, is one of the people on here. So she's the best person in the world. I don't know what we'd do without her.
Oh, I love that plug. Yeah, no, Linda was our speaker last month and she was amazing.
Yeah.
So definitely echo that support for Linda. The next question in the chat was about some of the indigenous expertise that Greenbelt Land Trust utilizes. Do you bring in knowledgeable experts to provide guidance?
Yeah, I'd say we do quite a bit of information sharing with our local tribes, so mainly Siletz and Grand Ron. We by that I mean we do tours for them and they do tours for us, and we talk about what's going on. As part of the conservation process, one of our first steps when we're looking at a property is to reach out to the tribes. We don't call first dibs. We don't compete for properties. Any protected property is a good thing for us. So if we reach out to a tribe and they say this is something they want to go for, then we hand things off and provide as much information as we can. And then part of the restoration planning process, we bring the tribes back on and do walkthroughs and whatnot. So, and then also just incorporating some of our knowledge of the history of the area and how things are managed is also really important.
Awesome. All right. And then I think for our last question of the evening, we have how would one person implement some of this on a smaller scale? So thinking about someone who has 4 acres but would love a prairie or a vernal pool, like where would someone start?
You saw my four-year plan, and then my sort of 1 year, my what I do a typical year. You could probably take those two slides and adapt them to your property. You might be able to do it in 3 years. Be willing to use the tools in the toolbox as well. And I'd say the most important thing, and Linda maybe probably said the same thing, is the most important thing is prepping to receive plant materials. That's the most important part. If you don't have good prep, then you're not going to have good success. And that's important to us, especially when we're looking to spend $80,000 on seed. And once you put it down, it's there. You can't suck it back up. So prep, have a pretty good idea of your plant materials as well is pretty important. And
Yeah,
your
know
end
that.
goal.
Yeah, we have a couple questions about particular species mixes for flowers, and those you can get from your local NRCS office, or you can get lists of suggestions from the bee stewards based off of your bee biodiversity. But thank you so much, Andy, for joining us. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, good luck, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the class.
Thank you so much.